Can labor market data really be used to provide a competitive advantage? There are a number of issues that could impede one's ability to use such data, but what about real time labor market data? Also, how can leveraging real time labor market data transform your revenue growth strategy and create a sustainable competitive advantage in the B2B tech landscape? These are questions I think our guest is well placed to answer. But first, hello and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast brought to you by Sproutwood.com. I'm Vinay Koshi and our guest is Cary Sparrow. Now, Cary, you're the founder and CEO of WageScape, where you provide developers, analysts, and consulting firms with access to the world's largest and most up-to-date labor market data collection. This, I believe, makes the labor market more transparent, opening doors to more efficiencies and world-changing innovation. You were, I believe, a former US Navy submarine officer, having served on several nuclear submarines, but you've also got something like well over 35 years of engineering, military consulting, and operations leadership, and achieved organizational growth within HR, IT, engineering, and technology verticals. Now, that's quite a resume. And I'm curious, though, was there a particular incident that led you to create WageScape as we know it today?
Yeah, so what's the origin story? First of all, thanks for having me on the
Pleasure.
show. I always love talking to folks, and I'm appreciative of being able to reach your listeners today. So I have a bit of an unusual career path, as you were laying out. I started in the Navy with an engineering background, a love of computers, and was immediately all of that was obsolete because I was on submarines and responsible for things like nuclear reactors and tactics and operation schedules and things like that. And when I got out of the Navy, I joined a consulting firm where I got just a tremendous insight on how companies across all industries, all sizes, all kinds of different business situations worked and dealt with those, and kind of rose through the ranks there and ultimately began to lead different parts of the business. So got to run different business parts and innovate within the consulting framework. And then from there, a lot of that work was around helping organizations manage their people better.
Mm.
And jumped out into the corporate world where worked for a really large global organization, really upgrading their overall infrastructure for managing their workforce. So all the HR systems and data and all the organization and the governance that went with that, and sat on global HR and global IT leadership teams. And along the way, just got a really deep appreciation of how powerful really good data is and how limiting really bad data is, and reached the conclusion that a lot of HR data that relates to a lot of workforce data that relates to what's going on in the labor market was really very poor by any objective standards. And the underlying reasons for that were that the data is really hard to get your hands on. It's spread across all kinds of organizations. And even when you do get your hands on it, it's really hard to interpret from one company to another to be able to build a picture of what's going on. And why is that important? Because things like jobs and hiring and pay and skills and the availability of talent and the demand for workforce and the ability to keep your workforce and keep them engaged and so forth all depend on those kinds of insights. And if you don't have good insights there, you're really hampered as an organization. And I looked at, okay, why is the data on this so poor and what can be done about it? And realized that there was a better way to do things. And that became the genesis of what has grown into WageScape, which was building a next generation platform that took real time information about things like who's hiring and how much are they paying and what skills are they looking for, and bringing it together in a way that's very transparent, very real time, updated daily. Later added in data around who's out there that can actually do the jobs and what skills do they have and where do they come from and where do they sit and so forth, that combined together support all kinds of different use cases for being able to get insights that are useful and practical for all the reasons that you mentioned at the
Mm.
beginning, efficiencies, but especially innovation.
Mm.
And so that's actually proved out pretty well. But the original insight was just an economics perspective. That's you've got this massive market that represents about 100 trillion every year, 100 trillion US worldwide every year in wages and benefits. And it touches literally every life on the
Mm.
planet. And people care really deeply about it. And so if we can create innovations on that market, those innovations are things that I wouldn't even necessarily be able to imagine, and they can touch broad swaths of society. And at the same time, from a B2B standpoint, working with enterprises and folks that serve enterprises, be able to drive competitiveness, be able to drive efficiencies. There's a huge amount of waste associated with trying to figure out what to pay people, as an obvious
Mhm.
example. And executives still don't trust the data on pay benchmarks and such. And that was the inspiration for it, coupled with, and so why did I form a business on it? I'm not, if other people were going to be working on this, then I wasn't going to declare that I had the best insight in the world and go and try and compete with that. But the reality was, at the time I formed WageScape, nobody else was working
Mm.
on this. There were a couple of firms, but their vision around it was not a vision of the labor market. It was a vision around being able to recruit better, or be able to configure university curriculum programs better and things like that, which are all
Mm.
really useful, but they're only tiny slices of the potential value from that. So jumped in and set up the business. So I had an inspiration around, there's a pain point societally.
Mm.
There's a pain point within enterprises, and there seems to be an opportunity that nobody's really going after in the way that I think they could. So it turned out to be, as most founders I think would admit, a very naive view of the world.
Brilliant, brilliant.
I've learned a ton about everything I just said and everything that was wrong. I very quickly adopted like a reminder every day. Some different people have like different
Mhm.
affirmations, and I developed the affirmation every day that literally everything that I think I know is wrong.
Mm.
Everything. And it actually, I've got a big poster in my, you can't see it, in my office that says that everything was wrong. And that's true to different degrees. And every day as a founder, the challenge was prioritize the things that we have to know, and then figure out how to go and know more about
Mhm.
them, recognizing that whatever we think we know is wrong in some ways. In some ways, they're little technical realities. Some cases, they're really big. Who are the potential customers for this kind of information? And what do they need in order to buy it? What are their buying habits? And what are the barriers that are in the way? And it turned out that all of my assumptions around that when I started the business were completely
Mm.
wrong. But along the way, figured out all kinds of other things that we could do and ways that we could sell and so forth. And so it's been an interesting journey over going on. So 9
Oh,
years
wow.
now, been doing
Okay.
this.
That's
Yeah.
brilliant. I'd love to explore that a little bit more, but I'm also curious, given your journey to date, what would you say is your personal area of strength?
I jump between strengths on any given day,
Okay.
and have way more weaknesses and limitations than strengths. One of the things that I had to develop a really strong sense was, or capability around, was, came from the insight that whatever problem I was trying to solve or my team was trying to solve, somebody else had solved almost an identical problem already.
Mm.
And so our challenge, and what we built an entire company around, was built on the notion that we don't have to know the answer to everything. We have to figure out where the answer exists and how to adapt it to our problems. And so we got really good at doing
Mm.
that, really good early on. And as a result, have been able to build a very highly scalable company, a very efficient company. We have the largest data set in the world for the world's labor market. And it keeps
Mm.
growing, right? It's growing and growing. So we're not anywhere close to done there, but it's still the largest in the world. And did that with literally less than a dozen team members. And so we collect it, we curate it, we maintain it, we adapt it, we add, we expand on it, we build partnerships, and we bring it to market. And we build brand awareness and all of that. And we do it with just a handful of people. And early on, I said, I want to build an organization that's really scalable and isn't dependent on growing a huge
Mm.
team, and isn't dependent on a variety of other things that are limitations for other businesses. So I would say that figuring out how to prioritize and solve problems, or in a very practical
Mhm.
way, is one of our strengths. It's one that we continue to sharpen the sword around. It's never
Mhm.
ending task to get better at that, especially as we grow and get more complex. But it's really different than what in a corporate environment. A lot of times, senior people in a corporate environment are expected to know the answer, or they're expected to compile a team around
Mhm.
them of experts that do know the answer. And for us, it's about very efficiently going out and figuring out what the answer needs to be,
Mhm.
based on what other people have done. There's only about 1% of the things that we do that are truly unique to us, and we're really good at them. But all the other 99, we're really good at figuring out who else has done it.
Mm.
So and I think I've talked to lots of other startup founders, and that's a message that either other people have figured out on their own, or that really resonates with folks who haven't figured it out yet. I have another founder that has been a bit of a mentor to me, and his favorite expression is R&D,
Mhm.
right? Always got to be paying attention to R&D. R&D stands for rip off and duplicate, which is if somebody else has come up with it and it's not tied down by a patent or a trademark and it's not going to jeopardize a relationship, then feel free to steal shamelessly. And I would encourage any startup founder to pursue that because there's a ton of things, whether it's product ideas or technical solutions or market perspectives where somebody else has a really good view. And rather than saying we got to figure it out on our own, we're just like, this is a great starting point. So let's go.
Mm.
That was a long, rambling answer, I think, to your question.
No,
So
you've answered
maybe a good
pretty
place.
well. And I was going to ask you, what in that area of strength is something that businesses don't know but should? I think you've answered it, but I wonder if you could perhaps give us a bit more of a direct answer, if I could put it that way.
It depends on the nature of the business. If you're in a startup environment and you've never done it before, then the appreciation that a lack of speed will kill you
Hmm.
is something that unfortunately you have to learn through pain, I think. But it's absolutely true. There are so many external factors that are single points of failure for my business. Still, 9 years in, there are things that could happen today that will kill the business overnight that I have no control over. The only control I have is to build a presence that can turn into a predictable source of revenue and brand development that leads to further growth, that puts a moat around what we're doing. But even there's stuff that
Hmm.
can kill the business. And so adopting that whole mindset and then very quickly parsing down and saying, what are the things we have to move really fast at and ignore everything else. And along the way, you build in other things that you got to worry
Hmm.
about. Don't lose customers. That's a really important thing to the extent that you can avoid it, because that's just revenue that you got to make up. And yeah, but the whole notion of speed, I think, is something that, having come from a corporate
Hmm.
environment and having come from a sales and delivery environment on the consulting side, so professional services, and now being in a startup environment, I would say, especially in startup, but also particularly, I think folks that are in sales know this, right? They know you got to be
Yep.
fast. You got to strike while the pain is pronounced and the willingness to address it is there. And good sellers move quickly, and sellers that don't move quickly don't stay sellers for very long,
Hmm.
right? It's the same thing in the startup world. Folks on the corporate side, though, totally different. It's totally different in perspective. The whole notion around how to manage risk in a corporate environment is turned completely upside down compared to what you have in a business development and especially in a startup environment. There, it's easier to take a more measured approach. It's easier to protect what you have. You're generally rewarded for removing risks from the organization. And so the status quo, increments off the status quo, minor increments are be the kind of tend to be the norm unless there's a disruptive situation. So it's interesting, having worked in all of those different environments, to reflect on what's been so critical for success in each of those. And then what does that mean as our business continues to grow and evolve? Because there's parts of the business where risk management is absolutely critical, like keeping customers. But there's other parts where if we don't move fast, so any answer is better than any answer today, a lot of times is better than no answer until a month from now or next quarter. And really embracing that mindset is totally different. So it's
Right.
situational. And I think if for anyone who's changing environments or where their business model is changing, just being cognizant of that, I think, is really
Hmm.
important. So if you change environments, whether the business is growing, gone through a phase of growth that now you've got bigger teams, or you've got different kind of customer requirements, or you're adding in different kinds of products, your organizational approach has to change with that. And if you're not mindful of that, you're going to end up failing, I think, because what made you successful today is not going to make you successful
Hmm.
tomorrow, to use an overused phrase. And especially if you're changing environments from like one type of business to another, or one businesses that are at very different
Hmm.
stages of maturity.
Sure.
Uh, you got to recognize that your style's got to be totally
Yep.
different.
I wonder if we can explore WageScape and what you do there a little bit more. You alluded to the fact that there are certain misconceptions CEOs and perhaps senior executives have about the labor market data. I'm curious if you could expand on these and tell us how WageScape addresses these misconceptions.
Yeah, so I would say that especially coming out of the pandemic, where you went from a period where typical wage growth rate was in the 2 to 3%, maybe 2 to 4% per year, and that had gone on since the
Mhm.
early 80s. Basically, an entire generation and a half of professionals had lived in that very stable kind of environment where if your data was 3 months old or 6 months old, or in some cases even a
Mm.
year old, it didn't really impact the precision required from the decisions that you had to make. And then coming out of the pandemic, the labor market went out of bounds worldwide. We from 2020 to 20 through the end of 2022 and into 2023, advertised wages in the US rose on average across all markets, across all jobs by 20% per year. Okay, so now we're going from 3% a year, call it, to 20% a year for everybody coming through the door. And every single person in your organization is being hit up because there's massive talent shortages. They're being hit up with offers, of pay that are substantially higher. And there's no way that organizations can compete with that except to start paying more. And we saw all that,
Mhm.
right? Traditional forms of information are completely useless in that environment because they have tons of like salary surveys, economic predictions, and so forth. They're built on really small, relatively small sample sets. They've got a ton of assumptions around how conditions evolve over time that are based on models that were developed during this really stable period. And that frankly, also during that really stable period, what was happening at the state level or the regional level was more than adequate to define what you needed at a metro level or within a city. All of that flew out the window. And companies came face to face and executives became extremely frustrated that the data they had available to them was not able to show what was actually happening. It was very late, it wasn't localized. And if you're dealing with employee populations that are very pay sensitive, that is, they will literally go to a competitor a mile away, 2 miles away, or next door. In the case of a lot of hourly workers, for an extra 50 cents an hour, you've got to know those things.
Mm.
And there was no source of information available to do that, except for there's a handful of folks that deal with our kinds of information, and we can do that. And so there's this general distrust, I think, because the methods for collecting and analyzing data about what's happening in the labor economy are extremely outdated. That's starting to change. But that's what people have grown up around. The other thing is that not only are they outdated, but they're inconsistent. So there was a study done not too long ago that compared three of the leading sources of pay information based on salary surveys for the same job, and they looked at what those pay rates were, the median pay rates for those. And you would think that they should line up pretty closely if you're measuring the same job
Mm.
in the same territory. Then and you're surveying companies and you're doing all the diligence, they should end up the same. No, it wasn't that way at all. The medians were like 15% away
Mm.
from each other, which is huge. Think about it. You can hide a How do you make budget decisions when your underlying data about what's going on in the market has a error level, a precision level that's up to 15 or more percent off? It's really challenging. And the folks making pay decisions and supporting kind of pay strategies have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to do that. The other thing is nobody can see where the data is coming from. And so one of the things that's really cool about what is available now with labor market data is that because it's coming from, we just walking through a little bit of what we do, we have a technology that goes out and pulls in data from all over the web about who's hiring and how much are they paying and what skills are they
Mhm.
looking for and so forth. And we update it every day. And in the US and other developed countries, we track about 80% of all the new jobs that are opening every day. And because all of this data starts in the public domain, and there's no expectation of privacy, there's no legal requirements to mask who's providing the data because the hiring companies are putting it out there for everyone to see. It's not like salary surveys that have a load of requirements, legal requirements on them, that they can't reveal who's actually paying whom and how much and so forth. And so there's a lot of transparency that's available now that wasn't available before. And so when it comes to like building trust in the data, there it is. You don't have to say, trust me, this is from the biggest, provider in the world. This is no, here it is. These are the actual companies within a block of my establishment. And here's what positions they're hiring and what they're paying for. And on the like career profile side, which is another part of data that we deal with, you can say, okay, here's exactly who we can see within those companies. Here's what their career history looks like. Here's what skills they have. Here's who's spinning off talent really well. Here's who's growing at a faster rate. Here's where they're hiring from and so forth. There's all kinds of transparency that's available now that from a competitive standpoint has never been there from before. And for anyone who deals in data, getting over that trust barrier of executives, transparency is huge. There's some other skills that you got to develop in order to use this kind of data because it's new and it has some features to it that you've got to get used to. But it's this issue of transparency, variability, and being out of touch with what's
Mhm.
actually happening right now and locally. So I mentioned what the pay rates were in 2020 through the beginning of 2023 as they were being advertised, and they've plateaued.
Mm.
And so economic data is now catching up to that. And we knew it was happening as it was happening. But economic data is now catching up and saying, hey, wage growth is starting to come down. Hiring rates have come down. Even though job growth rates have still gone up, the actual intensity of hiring has tapered off a
Mm.
bit. And we can see all that in the data. But that's at an aggregate level. So that's like at a national
Right.
level. That's absolutely not true at a local level. There are certain metros in the US that for a given type of job, wages are still under enormous pressure. And there's others where wages are actually able to go down a little
Mm.
bit. And so folks have really become much more sensitized to the fact that there is no one labor market. It's a very localized situation. And especially so, regardless of what your footprint is, understanding kind of what local conditions look like is now critical. And in the past, it didn't have to
Mm.
be.
You touched upon driving innovation through the data that you provide. I'm curious, could you paint a bit of a picture to wrap our minds around that particular use case, and perhaps maybe even going beyond that, because innovation at the end of the day is sought after simply because it would help drive revenue growth. So if you could speak to both revenue growth and innovation, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. The examples I'm going to give you are mostly B2B
Mm.
examples. There's examples that face kind of society at large, I think, that we could get into, but those are more formative right now. The more concrete examples are in kind of the B2B space. So here's a couple of real examples. If you're recruiting somebody and you need to work with a hiring manager on what to pay them, you either guess or you have to go do a whole bunch of research to
Mm.
look for what the job is, which is really cumbersome. And now there's technology where that data is embedded directly in the recruiting application that you're working on. And so recruiters don't have to think about it. So they're able to look at where a wage is out of bounds with hiring expectations and instantly and very credibly be able to guide that kind of conversation. Now, that's as much of an efficiency play as it is an innovation play. But what it means is that there's technology that's evolving in order to make recruiting much more effective. And so the innovation really is on the recruiting side because the cost of turnover is huge in this
Mm.
environment. The cost of losing somebody, the cost of having to support overtime for somebody that's filling in for an open position wipes away a ton of any efficiency savings. And so that's like a very kind of geeky, very focused recruiting example. We have a client that is in the financial services space that actually there's two examples in the financial services space. One is a media company that publishes financial information and allows their users to see what's going on with individual companies and stock prices and things like that. And they offer a product that has non-traditional data in it to allow individual investors additional insights that can guide their trading decisions. And one of the fields of data that's included is what's going on with hiring rates for individual companies and what's going on not just in the aggregate for that company but for the different kinds of jobs that are being hired and so forth.
Mm.
And that's a brand new product set that is serving individual investors, that is a whole new revenue stream for this particular client. We're one part of that. There's another financial services company that we work with that provides non-traditional credit scoring.
Mm.
So typical credit scoring has to do with what job do you have, what do your tax returns look like, and all that goes into kind of a credit score, right? It's all very financial But there's other factors that go into, like your risk that you're going to have a job, or the risk that you're lying about your job, or the risk that your pay is not going to be going up, and so forth. And we provide data on what's going on with local pay and hiring on jobs that these folks factor into their risk scoring model that is then provided to companies, that to lending organizations. And so that's a whole space that didn't exist in as meaningful a way a number of years ago, that's made possible by new types of data, and a whole business model that is driven by new types of data. There's a number of companies that are starting up in the human capital or HR tech space, where labor market intelligence is being built right into their processes. If you want to know what's going on in the labor market, whether it's pay or hiring or whatever, you can buy a SaaS application. Like, we offer a SaaS
Mm.
application that is a business intelligence tool that will allow you to go in and analyze that to whatever degree of detail you want, basically. Uh, and for some folks that have paid for analytics teams, that's absolutely the right solution, or they've got analysts on staff that already do that kind of thing. This makes their work a lot more effective. But for most end consumers of individual processes, like workforce management processes, going out and finding another application is not really what they want to
Mm.
do. So embedding that intelligence in applications is absolutely a value add. It can be an added revenue stream for the technology providers, and it can be the catalyst to form entirely new companies, which we see. We have partners that do that kind of thing. So there's lots of ways from an innovation standpoint. If you're in the business of data,
Mm.
like we are, 1 plus 1 does not equal 2, it equals like 10. So if we're able to combine data from multiple domains and make it easier for people to acquire and analyze, then it's like the music industry. When you've got one artist that has a guest artist on one of their songs, you suddenly combine both of their audiences. And there's commercial opportunities that each artist has that can apply to the other
Mhm.
artist's audience. From a data standpoint, you can do the same thing. And that's a whole space that's evolving pretty quickly. And we're pretty excited about it. But the ability to reach new audiences with our data and bring to our audience data that goes beyond what they've traditionally been able to
Mhm.
access, I think is hugely valuable. And from a business model standpoint, there's a lot of innovation potential from that standpoint. So there's innovation can play out in lots of different ways. From a societal standpoint, I would say hold on to your seats, because this whole notion of transparency is like in the very first at bats of the very first inning of the first game in the
Mhm.
series, right? Because the implications of people are talking about AI has the spotlight right now. Transparency has the potential to be extremely transformative within society and extremely threatening to enterprises. The ability to see talent movement, workforce management practices, the ability to overlay with concrete data things like employment equity, pay equity, organizational diversity and inclusion into what's going on in other people's
Mhm.
companies is just now starting to come out of the labs and into the market. And when we play that out for the next 3 to 5 years, that kind of transparency is going to start to be the norm. And it means that people outside of your company will know an awful lot about your company beyond just what you tell them in your financial statements. And if you're a private company, you don't tell them anything.
Mhm.
And now suddenly anyone that wants to work with you will have tools available to them, if they want to avail themselves of them, that show you things about how you manage that company. So that's why I said hold on, because I think that's a whole realm of innovation that, like I said, is just starting to come out of the labs.
Okay. There's at least a couple of questions that come to mind, but perhaps we can start with this. Could you elaborate? I think you alluded to the idea of forming strategic partnerships that would help
Mhm.
integrate, help B2B, say tech companies in particular, integrate labor market data into the operations to drive revenue growth. Could you elaborate on how those partnerships could be formed?
Yeah, so we've set up our entire business around those kinds of partnerships. So a significant part of our revenue, and an even bigger part of our revenue growth projections are from partnerships like that, where our data enables a new product
Mhm.
capability with our partners. And in order to do that, you really have to take a step back and say, Why do you want to do that? For us, it's all about the tail, the revenue tail, and it's all about the brand tail,
Hmm.
right? The ability to work with companies that influence large audiences along the way. We create, once you're in, if you can structure the deal properly, it's very lucrative for everybody. Everybody makes money if you can structure the deal right. And so back to one of the things that you've talked about with your audience in the past around this notion of a stable revenue stream, we view partners as a critical component of that whole principle. But you've got to then say, okay, this is why we would want it, and this is why our partner would want it. What gets in the way of that?
Mm.
And the things that we found that get in the way of that are, there's a learning curve associated with the data. A lot of times there's a product concept, but going from concept to a lab prototype to the market is highly iterative. It's usually takes longer, and there's more uncertainty. So there's a lot less willingness to spend money to create more fixed costs until you're actually in market. So we work very well with clients to say, hey, we're going to support you through the whole. We have what's called an R&D license. In this case, it's a research and development license, and it's structured very differently than our commercial licenses, and it's specifically designed so that we're not overburdening our partners with fixed costs while they're in the product development, product discovery, market, and then market introduction
Mm.
phases. But it's also, those also transition to commercial licenses that once a product starts selling and generating revenue for our clients, we share in that revenue.
Mm.
And so it aligns all incentives. So that's one of the ways that that happens. The other way is we got to make it easy for people to actually implement our data in their solutions. So we've worked really hard to standardize and simplify what it takes in order to build an additional data set into an intelligence product. And so that reduces the time or increases the speed of development. It takes a lot of the risk out. So it really is like you've got to really crawl inside the head of the folks that you're working to develop partnerships with, and saying what's getting in the way of that success where we both
Mm.
win, and then removing all of those barriers.
Right. And you also touched upon transparency. Now, if I remember correctly, you say you're able to go out and access data that's available in the public domain. And I'm curious, with all that we're hearing about misinformation being put out in the public domain, is it not inconceivable that at some point in time people might intentionally put out misinformation that's related to their hiring activities? If so, how do we build in the filter to check for those?
So it's conceivable, but the awareness around the implications of transparency, I would say, is so low right now that I don't see that dynamic
Mm.
happening in a meaningful way in the future. There could very well be certain situations in highly competitive
Mhm.
arenas where that's happening. But think about it. If you have a recruiting process where you got to go find critical talent, you have to communicate to the world what you're looking for, because that's where people
Yeah.
go. They go out into the cloud, into the web, to see who's hiring for the things that I bring to the table. And you can't game the system too much. You might be able to add some noise to it, but fundamentally the signal's got to be there, because
Mm.
otherwise you completely defeat the purpose that you're trying to pursue. It's the same thing. The transparency around what talent is out there, companies, there, I don't see how they can game the system. Individuals might and do
Mhm.
game the system there, where they present themselves in different ways. There's long histories of fraudulent resumes, but for the most part, people are, yeah, for the in the vast majority of cases, the degree of fraud is not there. And frankly, given the kinds of analysis that you want to look at, it's pretty fault tolerant when it comes to imprecision caused by noisy source data. But there, in terms of gaming the system, that's the thing where I say hold on, because all of your employees are communicating to the world exactly what their careers are doing. And you have, as a CEO or head of HR or CFO in an enterprise, you have no control over
Yeah.
that at all.
And thank you for clearing that up. With this idea of budget cycle constraints, how can companies navigate around that to ensure more of a predictable revenue stream?
Welcome to my world. So One way you can do it is to choose audiences and buyers that have fewer budget constraints.
Sure.
But barring
Yeah.
that, depending on the businesses that you're pursuing, frankly, having sat on both sides of the desk as both selling and buying in human capital, HR functions like any enabling function in a
Mhm.
company is extremely budget constrained, and they have very stringent controls typically on what they spend money on, which means that any HR executive knows how to be good at getting what they know they're going to need next year built in and vetted, and the support for approval in the during the budget process, which typically starts 4 to 5 months in advance of a new fiscal year. So their investigation, their planning process informally starts months before that.
Mhm.
So you're looking like year-long sales cycles that you got to deal with, which means you got to build sales methods to be able to do that. And so how do you do that? If you're dealing with, in the case of HR, if you're dealing even with five-figure, definitely six-figure budgets, you got to start long in
Mhm.
advance. So you have to have a sales capability that starts long in advance. When you start reducing that price point, believe it or not, you still have to start pretty long in advance because it's so tightly constrained. So, how do you make it easier for folks to begin using your product in a way that starts loosening up money? It's not. It's really hard, even at very low price points, I would say. It's really hard. So, then you got to get creative. You got to look at who's going to have the biggest pain points, where suddenly the head of HR's problem is also the CEO's problem, and the CEO has the authority to make budget problems go away.
Mhm.
And so, how do you identify where those pain points are and really rapidly capitalize on them? Which means that you've got to have the sales capability to do those things, but you also have to have the brand presence so that you're a trusted entity when the head of HR says, okay, here's somebody that we can work with. And the CEO goes, okay, I got it, go. So there's a variety of factors there, but part of it is you just got to be constantly laying the groundwork for that. Sales opportunities can come up really quick, and you got to be able to respond to them and secure those sales very quickly. And when you do that, the sales cycle can be really short and totally independent, asynchronous to the budget process. Otherwise, a lot of sales are going to come out of the budget process, and you just got to be diligent and persistent and have a lot of forethought in terms of how you're positioning yourself for
Mhm.
that. I wish there was a much better answer to that. Where you pick to sell to, though, is a big determinant, I
Yeah.
would say. If you've got a product that can sell to, that it sells exclusively to a part of an HR function, you're going to have a much more constrained kind of market opportunity than if you have a product that sells to operations leaders, for
Mhm.
example.
Now, brand development has played a major role, if I understand this correctly, in a WageScape's strategy. What's really worked for you in terms of your brand development?
This is one where the underlying principle is pretty well vetted view of adoption
Mhm.
dynamics, which is that when you have a new product, and a product can be an idea or it can be a technology or it can be a service or whatever. Jeffrey Moore really pioneered this in his book, The Crossing the Chasm, that there are visionaries who will immediately see potential around whatever it is that you're developing. They're very aligned in their perspective with whoever the founder of the business is, and you can drive early revenue just based on that audience. But there's everybody else, though, requires proof points. They have budget constraints. They need to see how something actually performs. They need to see how it applies to their business. They need to be able to articulate a business case associated with that, and they need to do it with a degree of credibility that is built on proof points. And those are, the first ones that do that are the early adopters. And when the visionaries start to run out, there's this gap before the early adopters see
Mhm.
enough proof points to be able to come on board. And most actually new ideas don't cross that gap. And so brand is essential for doing that. At least that's our discovery. So how do we deal with that? We're much less concerned about growing the number of customers that we have and the number of partners we have than building the quality of them at the stage of the business that we're in. So we work with the best known brands in their space. We work to secure those, and that's where our focus is. Yes, we're interested in serving whoever will get value from our data and our data products, but we have a very specific view of who are the mavens, who are the thought leaders, the ones that when somebody goes to make the case to their CFO or their CEO or their board about why they should be spending money on WageScape's data, they can say, been used by X, Y, and Z. And those are instantly recognizable names that bring an imprimatur of quality and of excellence with them. And that's a key part of our strategies. It's like a B2B version of an influencer
Hmm.
strategy. And that's part of, and I'm not sharing anything that I'm sharing it to the world. That means that it's not about the thought, it's about the
Mm.
execution and having the kind of product to back it up. But that's how we look at things is who's going to influence the biggest audiences because we're still in that visionary stage in terms of using kind of real-time labor market intelligence and seeing just the beginnings of its potential. We're still in the visionary stage, and depending on the use case, we're starting to cross that chasm,
Mm.
right? And so we're really targeting what's going to happen when the early adopters come on board because that's when the growth really starts to happen. And what condition does our business need to be in when that happens? So from a brand standpoint, that means who are the folks that are already using the data? What are the use cases that show kind of the possibilities of it? And then what's our marketing position in terms of all the different P's that go into the marketing strategy and all of that.
Is there a place?
I hope I answered the question on that.
You,
We could talk for a long time on that.
you certainly did, and I'm curious. Is there an education element as well that you currently have
Oh
or
yeah.
looking at developing?
Yeah, there's a huge education element. And so that's a part of what we do. When I do, I speak at a number of events and talk specifically around not only what are the possibilities associated with real time market data that really is high precision, large scale, real time market data, but there are limitations too. Like it's noisy data. So how do you deal with that? It's transparent. That sounds like a real strength, and it is, but also it means you got to be ready to shine a light on things in a very credible way that goes against, in a lot of cases, the conventional wisdom or shows a hiring manager, hey, there's this one case where so and so got offered something that's twice what we pay. But if you look at what every one of our competitors for that job is doing in that market, it's way out of bounds. And so we're not going to change. That's not reason to change our whole pay
Hmm.
structure just for that one anecdote. And depending on the strength of will of whoever you're talking to about that, that can be really uncomfortable. So part of the education is you got to understand the data and where it comes from. That's tier one of education around kind of our data platform. But the other is, okay, what are the implications that are different than how you use data before? There's more things you can do with this, but there's other things that you have to make sure you're anticipating. And one of those is dealing with noisy data, and one of them is being able to deal with transparency in a very constructive way. Another is owning kind of the dialogue of what's going on in the market. So it's really helpful if you can be the source of truth of what's happening in the market. And that means that you can't just show up when something happens and say, here's what our data says. You've got to be in front of that, whether you're regardless of your job. If people expect you to know what's happening in the market, you have got to be bringing those audiences along with what's actually happening in the market before they actually need it, before they need that insight. And so there's new skills that organizations need to deal with new capabilities represented in the kind of data we deal with.
Mhm. I'm just doing a quick time check here, Cary. I know we've covered a fair bit of ground, but is there an aspect or two around this idea of real-time labor data and using it to drive growth that you find it doesn't get talked about very much? If so, what would they be?
So I think the thing that surprises our clients and the people that we talk with that we have exposure to our data is the amazing possibilities with competitive intelligence. Keep in mind that people typically have not been able to see inside their
Mm.
competitors. They've not been able to even see who all their competitors are. From a talent standpoint, there's way more people hiring the kinds of talent you need than you're aware of. And so the ability to go in and say, here's the actual companies and here's what they're hiring and here's when they were hiring it and what skills they needed and do it completely trained. People are amazed by that. So I think the usefulness and the innovation around that and all are barely even recognized, let alone being tapped into.
Mm.
And but it's the single thing people are most amazed by, I think. So that would be one thing, and that goes back to my point around transparency. Hang on, because there's more of it coming.
Mhm. To wrap things up, if you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
If you're in the business of needing to have market intelligence, the top takeaway would be there's much more sophisticated capabilities from a data standpoint that are available now that you can tap into, and you should learn about them. If you're in the B2B space, especially if you're a startup founder, or you're in a startup, or you're in a high growth company, I would say that a number of the phases of life around that I've shared represent my view on it, but there's a number of takeaways there that I think are really valuable as well. There's the theory of startups, and there's the practice of
Mhm.
startups, and what it takes to grow. And we've lived the practice, and a lot of times the theory is okay, but this whole how to manage what you have to do, and that evolving fairly rapidly, is one of the things to just be very mindful of, I would
Mhm.
say.
Brilliant. And a final question: if sorry, listeners are curious, want to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
If you want to know more about WageScape, just go to wagescape.com. That's
Okay.
the easiest way. And if you want to connect with me, or you want even more information, you can find us on LinkedIn. You can find me personally on LinkedIn. You can find our company on LinkedIn
Okay.
too.
We'll include links to that in the show notes. Cary, thank you so much for doing this. It's been brilliant.
Hey, it's been a pleasure.
No